10.
Okay. Hello and welcome to the ninth in the session in the series on AI, neuroscience, and architecture. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Susan Schneider here today. But before I introduce her, let me just say a few things about this week. What's happening this week? There's been a very busy week for Digital Futures. Yesterday we had two sessions, a workshop, and also our first ever session in Portuguese, which is a big move forward for us, an amazing event in itself. This week we've got a series of other talks coming up. On the 25th of March, we have a session in Farsi, and since it's Persian New Year coming up in actually in a few minutes' time, I'm not sure whether we have any Persian viewers today, but Nowruz Mubarak, Happy New Year to our Farsi community. And then on Saturday, we have a session on clay printing in architecture. So this is the ninth in the series. The series is something set up by Digital Futures, a volunteer organization aimed at sharing knowledge across the world for free so that everyone has access to important educational ideas. And this particular series is part of the Doctoral Consortium, where we're trying to create a global platform, a global brain, to introduce a topic that will become of relevance today, where all PhD students, would-be PhD students, doctoral students, academics, and other interested parties can come together to share this information. And we've had an amazing series so far. We've got two more left. Andy Clark will be on next Sunday, and Antonio Damasio, continuing our Portuguese language thing, will be coming in April. We haven't quite set the date just yet, but I think it's going to be the second Sunday in April. And all of these are being uploaded to the Digital Futures YouTube library. As you can see, we're actually getting quite a few views. Yosha Bach, for some reason, being very, very popular, but we're getting 7.4 thousand. We're getting a lot of views for each of these sessions, and it's great to see that it's being appreciated. So today, it's a great delight to have Susan Schneider here, who is just down the road from FIU. She's at FAU. Susan, until November, was the NASA Baruch Blumberg Chair of Astrobiology and Technological Innovation at the Library of Congress and NASA, and is currently the Dietrich Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience at Florida Atlantic University, where she runs the Center for the Future Mind. She is the author of a series of books, the Blackwell's Companion to Consciousness, which came out in 2006, Science Fiction and Philosophy, published by Wiley and Blackwell in 2009, The Language of Thought, published by MIT Press in 2011, and then 2019, this critically acclaimed book, Artificial You, that came out, which is going to be the subject of the discussion today. And I'll just want to move on to some of the comments that we have about this, which is kind of interesting in itself, because two of the reviews of the book are by the contributors to the series, David Chalmers, who was on earlier on talking about his book, Reality Plus. Is artificial consciousness possible? Could you become an AI? Would you still be you? And then Andy Clark at the bottom there, what does it take to have a mind and be a conscious being? Could AI have a mind? Could it have a conscious mind? Might the best plan be for us to merge with our best AIs? And also, I should point out Russell Stewart, Russell, like Andy Clark, also from the UK, and somebody who's not only the leading authority, or at least the co-author of the book on artificial intelligence, but also somebody who is warning us about the potential dangers of AI. And he's the author of the book, Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control. Also, I might add, he is the sponsor of a very interesting short video documentary called Slaughterbots, which is actually warning us. I mean, it's actually warning us about the danger of autonomous AI-based weapons. And Susan is, of course, someone who is fundamentally interested in these questions of ethics, the ethics of AI. So I'd like to welcome Susan here today to talk both about her new book, Artificial You, and also her more recent concept of the global brain, something that I've been thinking about as a concept, and it'd be great to hear what you have to say. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction and for having me. Your other speakers sound fabulous, and I really can't wait to listen and share with my students the output of your series. Wow. So what I'm going to do today then is I'm actually going to talk about something that I'm working on now that is a sort of outgrowth of the book. So I'll just mention some background on the book, and then I'll go ahead and get started. So the book is basically within the field of philosophy of mind. So I'm trained as someone who thinks about the fundamental nature of things and, you know, especially the mind, but also the nature of reality in general. And so for the first half of the book, I examine the question of whether machines can be conscious. And I did it from the vantage point of worrying about the real world because of the ethical interest in machine consciousness. And I actually urged that we cannot yet know whether machines will be conscious. I took what I call the wait and see approach, which was basically in response to the leading views, which I see on the one hand as a sort of biological naturalist approach, which says that consciousness only inheres in biological entities. That's associated with the views of John Searle, for example. And the other side is what I call techno-optimism. And that's the usual transhumanist picture that says that if you have a highly complex entity, such as a brain or an artificial brain, consciousness will inevitably emerge. And I raised a number of considerations for taking a sort of wait and see approach. I mean, you know, we don't know what AI companies will want to do. I mean, this is an issue of, if you will, intelligent design, not Darwinian evolution. These systems will be designed by us. Furthermore, we don't have a sense of what microchips will be utilized. I mean, would they be made of carbon nanotubes? Would they be silicon based? I mean, we just don't know if microchips would be the right stuff for consciousness. There are a lot of concerns that I raise. And then in the second half of the book, I talk about the different issues involving radical brain enhancement. So I've long been a futurist. I was a transhumanist when I was in grad school, always fascinated by various issues involving radical brain enhancement and super intelligent AI, even before it became popular. And I'm keenly interested in the idea that humans might one day attempt to upgrade their brains through AI technology. There are other kinds of upgrades as well, like genetic alterations. Caffeine, I suppose, is an enhancement, but in the book, I focused on artificial intelligence. And I urged that there may be certain limitations on what we can do to the human brain, sadly. And, you know, I'll be getting to some of that today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn to my slide presentation, which is sort of an outgrowth of all of this. So after I published the book, I started to publish some op-eds and rant a little bit in places like the New York Times and the Financial Times, using science fiction thought experiments as a route into understanding what you can and cannot do with respect to radical brain enhancement. I urge that programs like what you might see at Neuralink, the sort of radical brain enhancement platforms, are actually philosophical minefields, making all kinds of hidden philosophical assumptions that actually may even be incorrect. And if all that research money is going in that direction, and if society is advocating that kind of change, we'd better think about whether it's even possible. Okay, so let me go ahead and start my slides. So just give me 1 second.
So you should be able to share the screen.
Yes, I want to share the screen. There we go. Just give me 1 second. Hopefully the power won't go out again. The power went out about 3 minutes before I was supposed to be on. I hear police cars now. Florida. Wonder what's going on. Okay, so can you see the screen okay now? Hello?
So can you make it full screen? The button at the bottom. On the
So
bottom
you
right.
don't see the slides?
Yes, I do, but if you make it full screen, it's just that the icon that's on the bottom right.
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now. How's that?
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, fabulous. And so, Neil, you want me to talk for about 30 minutes? Is that right?
You can carry on as you feel fit. I mean, we're just blotting paper. We'll absorb all your ideas. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, if you want me to stop midway through for questions and do it that way, I can, or I can just go blast through it and then we can do questions at the end.
I think questions at the end. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So I think we're part of a global brain, or that we will be part of a global brain. And I'm going to make that argument. I call it the global brain argument. Okay, so, and of course your pictures are blocking my ability to read the slides. So let me just see how to make that smaller. Ah, there we go. Okay, now I can't see myself. Good. Okay, so the global brain argument draws from scenarios about the future of AI currently envisioned by many, such as widespread technological unemployment, powerful multinational tech companies with advanced cloud-based AI at their disposal, the widespread use of wearable AI devices and or brain-machine interfaces. And the argument says, if some of these scenarios obtain, we will be faced with the future in which we are part of a global brain network, or we may be faced, that is. Okay, so this is a new talk. So I'm sure I'll learn a lot from the audience. So this is sort of a new book I'm writing that's coming out with Norton, a trade book. And here's a passage that I think captures my thinking on the issue, which I'll read to you. This was actually from the book proposal. So here's an idea I find horrible, yet hard to resist. We are already part of a computronium, the internet, a massive network that utilizes matter and energy throughout the globe for its computations. We are the sensory transducers delivering inputs into scores of machine learning systems. In the context of deep learning systems in particular, the data itself shapes the algorithm. Today's algorithms are but a disunified hodgepodge of fairly unintegrated programs. But over time, the disunified labyrinth of code could integrate in order to facilitate faster, higher bandwidth information transfer and communication between devices in the Internet of Things. Perhaps a single highly integrated system will emerge and be super intelligent, outperforming humans in every intellectual respect. The Internet computronium is created by us, and it depends on us. Its shape is determined by market forces and Internet regulations that could foster human flourishing or fail humans entirely, leaving us in a cyberpunk dystopia like the Borg on Star Trek. Okay, as usual, I'm very dystopian. Okay, so now here's the argument. Philosophers love to present formal arguments. So, I'm just going to lay it out in premise conclusion form and walk you through what each premise means. And in some cases, the terminology in this argument is novel. I just cooked it up. And I'll be walking you through that as well. And then once we do that, we'll talk about the implications of the global brain. Okay, so P1, premise 1, is what I call a hyperintelligence premise. And it says that AI continues to get smarter, and eventually there are hyperintelligent AIs being either savant or superintelligent systems. And I'll be going through this whole thing. Premise 2 offers what I call the global brain thesis. It says that one or more savant or superintelligent systems has an extensive cloud presence. It includes or cooperates with leading apps and search engines, such as, for example, you could envision a global Google brain. Premise 3 is the nodes premise, and it says that people become nodes in the system by wiring into the cloud hyperintelligence. Either they are neural linked in, if you will, or they have wearables, smart bodies, or, some mix of these. Premise 4, if 1 through 3 obtain. So if the above situations obtain, these wired in humans will become part of a global brain. Premise 5 asserts that 1 through 3 obtain. And the conclusion then, which I believe follows, is that wired in humans become part of a global brain. Okay, so now I'm going to walk through the different premises, and I'm always going to list the premise at the very top of the slide. So look at premise 1, and that's the hyperintelligence premise. It says that AI continues to get smarter, and eventually there are hyperintelligent AIs being either savant or superintelligent systems. Now, let me start by just reminding you, I'm sure this audience is very sophisticated, but I'll just state so we're all, refreshed on the issue, that a superintelligent system is defined as a system which is able to outthink humans in every respect possible. Here, I'm using the definition from Nick Bostrom's well-known book on superintelligence that came out with Oxford University Press. And that means that a superintelligence is able to outthink humans in domains such as mathematical reasoning, social intelligence, facial recognition, mathematical theorems, and so on and so on and so on. So in every respect possible, even moral reasoning, right? Okay, that's the technical definition. Now, the usual case for superintelligence that it could exist, because obviously superintelligence is hypothetical, is the following in rough outlines. AI is making impressive innovations, especially in the domain of deep learning, and billions of dollars are pouring into AI, and computational speed is, constantly increasing, costs are dropping. I won't try to defend Moore's law, but I mean, we're seeing over the years immense improvements in what we can do computationally, even with our home laptops. Furthermore, as the future goes on, we have reason to believe that AI will continue to excel, at least in domain-specific ways. Domain-specific intelligence is the kind of AI that you've seen do quite well in games, for example. So, for example, think about AlphaGo famously. And then as time goes on, and I actually agree with this, what we are seeing now is that AI isn't just domain specific, it's increasingly able to move from one topic to the next and one sensory domain to the next and be more integrative. An example of this would be the GPT-3 system, okay? And over time, the idea is that there's no in-principle reason why AI can't excel in the kind of general purpose reasoning that's distinctive of non-human animals and even humans. And given that an AI system doesn't have the same kind of metabolic demands and spatial demands, I mean, our brains are situated in our skull, it can, in fact, be instantiated globally. Even the case for superintelligence seems strong to me, at least. But to get to superintelligence, we have to hit AGI, or artificial general intelligence, according to this reasoning, which is intelligence that is functionally the same as human level intelligence. Okay, now that's the case for superintelligence. Now, premise 1 doesn't claim that we'll have superintelligent systems, even though I'm sympathetic to the idea. Premise 1 instead says that hyperintelligent AIs are either superintelligent systems or what I call savant systems. Okay, so I'm going to explain what a savant system is, but let me just say that if I'm correct, because a savant system is an earlier, more basic form of a system, that P1 actually applies in cases of simpler AIs. So now let me tell you what I mean by a savant system. And this terminology goes back, I think, to an interview about my work in Scientific American, where I sort of laid out what a savant system is. So savants are artificial general intelligences that are not necessarily human-like, okay? So I suspect that the first few generations of synthetic intelligence will be deficient in ways that normal humans are not. They will be savant-like, that is, surpassing humans in certain ways that involve sophisticated memory, databases, sophisticated pattern recognition, mathematical processing, and so on. So I call these hypothetical general intelligences savants because they have all sorts of deficits relative to normal humans while leaving us in the dust in other ways. So think about human savants. They can outcalculate us. They can memorize phone books, for example, do things that in many respects, we might consider to be superhuman, yet they have very strange deficits as well. And I think that given the pace of AI development, you can expect that highly intelligent AIs will not necessarily be functionally equivalent to us the way that AGIs are. And they won't be super intelligent. They won't outthink us in every way possible. Instead, I suspect that the early forms of hyperintelligence, that is very impressive AI intelligence, would actually be savants. So for that reason, that's what I'm talking about when I raise the hyperintelligence premise. So the premise again says that AI continues to get smarter, and eventually there are hyperintelligent AIs that are either savant or super intelligent systems. So that's sort of my sketch of where the future would go. I think this is interesting if you're interested in AI safety. So savant systems are potentially far more dangerous than superintelligences, I believe. Think about Jeffrey Dahmer. he had terrible deficits. Sociopaths do, right? Superintelligence wouldn't have deficits in their social intelligence. They wouldn't have deficits in their moral reasoning. Systems that have immense power to inform, say, presidents, or to compute the location of nuclear attacks and retaliate, like these dead hand systems, are enormously dangerous, and I believe they'll be savant systems. And these are the ones that I'm actually most worried about with respect to the control problem. Okay, now I want to go to the global brain premise. So the global brain premise says that one or more hyperintelligent systems has an extensive cloud presence, and it includes or cooperates with leading apps and search engines. So, an example of this is obvious to us. I mean, just given the sort of absolute power that Google has right now in so many different tech domains, their reach, you could maybe think that something like a global Google brain could occur. If you ask me to give a time frame, I don't like debating time frames so much because it takes time to do that to prove a point. But I mean, I'll just ballpark 10 to 25 years from now, this could be something that we see. To me, this seems like a reasonable approximation of a future in which Google succeeds in what it is doing now. Or perhaps the Chinese government or an overreaching Department of Defense in the US, in tandem with the tech giant, will accomplish this. Perhaps it would use Facebook's metaverse or some, later version of that, where there's a metaverse that's owned by a singular tech platform. None of these, I mean, when, I'll try not to get distracted by the ethics. We'll turn to that later. But I mean, these scenarios are not thrilling for me, to say the least. So now you might ask, what do you mean, Susan, by a global brain? Well, by this, I have in mind what we might call an AI superpower system. And of course, there could be several superpowers. So, I'm not saying that there will be one singular system that is the global brain. There could be multiple global AI superpowers that have a worldwide reach through the internet. And as I'll explore shortly, you'll be nodes in the global brain, and you could actually be a node in multiple global brains, which without even knowing it, okay? Which gets into some really interesting philosophical issues about the extended mind, for example. I know Andy Clark's coming soon, as well as philosophical issues involving the nature of knowledge and mental processing. Okay, so more generally, the ingredients of the global brain premise are the following. Market forces that are pushing for smarter AIs, including ever more expansive search engines, facial recognition systems, personal assistants, autonomous vehicles, and so on. An increasingly efficient and integrated inventory of Internet of Things items in homes and businesses, and humans who are able to utilize metaverse services for work and play. A more and more unified group of sensory transducers tracking biological weapons, pandemic risks, environmental hazards, cybersecurity risks, and so on, that are utilized in a world state sensor program. This has been talked about, and I think it's very attractive when you've got global catastrophic risks that are absolutely terrifying, future pandemics that are created in labs. You have global warming that needs to be tracked, cybersecurity risks. All of these things contribute to a sense in which it's attractive to have a global AI system that's connected to sensory transducers. Of course, that system doesn't have to have its processing transparent or accessible to everybody. It just needs to have a global reach. Further ingredients: one or more global tech giants that own the engines and have great political power. We kind of have this already. And finally, computational speed and efficiency, which is increasing, and cost dropping. And of course, I should have added the widespread availability of data, loads of data to train these systems if they're deep learning systems, because of course the deep learning algorithms depend on the data. Now, my hypothesis is novel, I think, but there's an older global brain hypothesis that I'd like to mention, because I think it's just so fun. Like, I went on a fun reading spree about a year ago. Of course, all the books are not here, so I'm not going to be able to cite them properly. But the older global brain hypothesis dates back to a series of books. I think the first one, if I'm remembering right, was in 1983. And there's now a Global Brain Institute, which Haylighton, the first author, generated, which, I love to follow what they're doing. Now, it tends to be more utopian, not anticipating the ills of social media because it dates back to 1983, not anticipating cyber wars, the control problem, AI tech monopolies. It was back in the days of the excitement of internet freedom, the transhumanist dream, all of those things, which I personally, expected the future of the internet to bring. And now, of course, these dreams have sort of tanked, although we hope that tech regulations will protect freedom and be friendly to different metaverse platforms and whatnot. But I mean, things are far more complicated as usual. This is always the case with emerging technologies. Well, anyway, the older global brain hypothesis was very utopian. It had three basic claims. It said that the internet will increasingly link its users in a single information processing system that functions like a collective self-aware nervous system at a planetary scale. That's cool to think about. Well, in contrast to that view, which, maybe could obtain, it may be that there is a single nervous system like global brain. I'm actually not committed to that, though. I mean, that's one of only a variety of possibilities for global brains that I'm interested in. Furthermore, I'm not committed to the intelligence having feelings, consciousness, or self-awareness. And, this goes back to my book, Artificial You, where I argued for a wait and see approach about machine consciousness. And it's not clear how far I would like to push the analogy with the nervous system. So, the older global brain hypothesis proponents pointed out that web browsers, search algorithms are like a basic prefrontal cortex, part of the brain responsible for executive function. And that like buttons, such as you see on Facebook, are like a primitive amygdala system. And further, that web pages are said to play a role similar to neurons and are connected by hyperlinks, which, are like neural connections and form a kind of associative network. The basic analogy is interesting, but I'm just not sure that I want to push it any farther than that. And I don't think that's really sufficiently brain-like to give rise to anything remotely like the human brain, or even the brain of a non-human animal. But I think there are so many interesting questions here. I mean, I'll give you an example. At what point would an incipient, intelligent, cloud-based system be anything like a hyper-intelligence? When would it be classified as, say, a savant system? It'd be interesting to devise metrics. Like, for example, I'd be interested in the integrated information theory by Tononi, like to look for integrated information, if not consciousness, in this context. And, these possibilities indicate that the presence of a hyperintelligence may not be apparent at all. And, for example, we might not have the right metrics to identify an incipient superintelligence or savant system, and it could be underground. So it could be in a lab somewhere that has access to the entire internet, but which is developed, say, by a defense department. And it has reason to not introduce itself, if you will. Okay, now let's go to more claims of the older hypothesis. Well, they claim that the intelligence of a global brain is distributed and collective. I agree. And that it has self-organizing emergent behavior between its components. And yes, of course. Okay, so the argument then, here you are. I'll give you a sense to read it. And now I'm going to turn to premise 3, the nodes premise, and then I want to close up soon to get to Q&A. So the nodes premise, which is in bold, says that people become nodes in the system by wiring into a cloud hyperintelligence. Either they're neuralinked in, think of brain chips, that's what I meant with that expression, or they have wearables, think, smart shirts, for example, or smartwatches, or a whole, bunch of cyborg-like body enhancements that have all kinds of sensors and compute, sort of like the arm of an octopus, a little mini brain is situated in each of those sensors. Well, if all of these things obtain P1 through P3, I'm arguing that wired in humans become part of a global brain. So let's see about P3, premise 3, the nodes premise. So what's a node, first of all? Well, a node is a spatiotemporally isolated state in the world, or object, something that's in space-time. You, your brain, a wearable shirt with computational abilities in it, a cyborg system. It's something that is able to provide sensory inputs. So it could be on an underwater submarine somewhere detecting algae levels, for example. Or it can compute, anyway, it's something that computes a function, some sort of a function for the hyperintelligent system. Okay, that's all a node is. Now, I think we will be wired in to a global brain in some fashion. In fact, arguably we're already wired into the internet now by my loose definition. I mean, if you're wearing, some sort of an Apple Watch, for example, or maybe even just carrying a smartphone. But it's too early to tell whether the sensors of the future will actually be physically embedded, excuse me, in the brain, because we don't know how fast this technology will occur, or if there'll be some other, like maybe there'll be a biological computational device that you wear that's not like a microchip, but is a sort of biological neural circuit, or maybe it'll be like an external wearable. And I think all this depends on tech regulations, medical issues, the pace of research, and so on. Of course, some cultures may have one, like you may see brain chips in China, that people are forced to wear, sadly. And you might see in the United States, for example, wearable technologies. It just depends. So let's talk trends then. You might wonder where things are at. Well, Musk has said that humans can keep up with AI by having a merger of biological and machine intelligence. And a few years ago, he created a company called Neuralink with the goal of creating an eventual implantable chip, allowing data from your brain to travel to your digital devices wirelessly. And you can see the videos on YouTube. I think now they have a monkey that's got the chip. But there's lots of other work. It's not just Musk. I mean, there's a company called Kernel, which is a pretty advanced and interesting company with a lot of interest in therapeutic uses, which are exciting. And on the level of therapeutic uses, I'm thrilled to note that there's an artificial hippocampus, which is currently in phase 2 clinical trials. So people are actually wearing the device, and it computes functions of the hippocampus in broad strokes for individuals who have radical memory loss. So, the hippocampus is the part of the brain which lays down new memory. So it would be super exciting if brain chips like that were able to actually be worn on a regular basis by individuals with memory loss. So, there's lots out there in terms of these research on both neural prosthetics as well as enhancements. Well, Musk had two concerns when he raised the issue that I quoted at the very top of the slide. He said that the reason he felt we needed to have a merger with machine and biological intelligence is to stop humans from being out of the loop when it comes to employment. So he's worried about the future of employment and that our own technologies could outmode us. And he's also worried about controlling superintelligence. So he's put a lot of money into trying to solve the control problem. Well, non-invasive wearables are actually less medically risky, and I think that will happen sooner. The commoditization of your biometric data has already started, and we're about a month away from beta testing a thought detection device at Facebook that actually is a wearable. I can talk about that in Q&A if you want. I call this kind of data thought data, and I think the future data economy will include what I would call a thought data economy, and it's beginning. Okay, you might wonder why anybody would provide their thought data given what's going on. But I think that this very well could occur, but I'm going to leave this to Q&A. But one reason we might see is technological unemployment. So people feel that they have to do it to keep their jobs. And another is obviously being entranced somehow with being connected to the internet or wanting to improve your psychological states through an implant device, or you could be in an authoritarian dictatorship and it forces you to wear tracking devices. Quite sobering. Okay, so then that's the global brain argument. So if those three premises that I laid out obtain, you would expect that we would be part of one or more global brains. Boy, okay, well, there's a lot to talk about, and I think I'll just stop here and see what your reactions are. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. That was great. That was great. I have to say that in some senses, you're preaching to the converted, because I've used the term global brain on this platform quite a bit, in fact, to try and understand what's happening. I guess let me just maybe put something to you. I mean, before I started thinking about AI, I was thinking about swarm intelligence, and produced a book in 2017 on swarm intelligence with an architect called Roland Snooks, which was I mean, just an overview of the discussions about multi-agent systems, about emergence and swarm intelligence itself. And I thought what was so useful about that was that it gets us beyond the sort of an attitude that was around that is kind of quasi mystical and spiritual in some ways. In other words, in architecture, we have this notion of the zeitgeist, which means what people are thinking about at a particular time. And we also have this kind of like idea of a kind of collective intelligence, which is, or genius loci, we should say it's localized and everything is the same in one particular area and so on. And that seemed to me to be too mystical, too spiritual, and so on. And it also, it failed to understand the individuals, failed to situate the individual. I think what swarm intelligence does, the idea of a flock of birds, for example, which each bird is kind of going in a certain direction, aware of the bird in front of the birds either side, and so on. And that model, which is actually interesting, in fact, is what we're doing. Maybe we're not birds in a flock, but we're aware of what's going on around us, and we're listening to it and things, and we're not. There is a kind of interaction between the individual and the global that is an operation, and that seems to make complete sense. Having said that, all the biggest kind of critique of swarm intelligence is but how intelligent is it? I mean, so I think that's the kind of the limitation. But there was in Stephen Johnson's work anyway. There was a sense in which all forms of multi-agent system, and he would include insects and certain software and human brains and cities. Was the model he was offering, a slightly imprecise, but nonetheless he was kind of sketching out something that the scientists had been working on and bringing it together as a kind of coherent and accessible theory. And so that theory was kind of interesting, albeit limiting because of the fact that because of the level of intelligence it implied. And therefore, what was interesting is a number of architects who are now working in AI, and that includes Daniel Bolajan, from FAU, were working on swarm intelligence initially, on multi-agent systems. That was really kind of the fascination that was going on. And Casey Reese and other people also are now doing that.
Oh,
wow. So no, I mean, I think the shift has been to AI, and it's super interesting for all sorts of reasons. But okay, so that is around anyway, and somehow it's how we're operating. I always thought that this kind of platform was a way of facilitating that, because it allowed, literally, in some cases, with people from all over the globe to come together, to think together. And actually, the word computation, of course, does mean that, to think together, even though computers don't think technically. So there was something that exists anyway that has been enhanced, shall we say, by the affordances of technology today. So, and what we discovered here was just from a very visceral kind of sense, there was an incredibly intense discussion that could happen when you brought together all the experts in the world, and that so. I can see that already happening anyway. So that's why I completely buy into the thesis. And it was something that we brought up, in fact, with Jeff Hawkins a few weeks ago.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So he was talking about 1,000 brains, and then we was kind of thinking, well, what happens if those brains themselves were part of 1,000 brains, and so on. So I think it's already there. So anyway, I just want to leave that with you.
Oh, wow. Well, can I respond?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited that you're in South Florida. And we should definitely grab coffee with Daniel and maybe even do an event at my center. So I'm thrilled. And can you tell me which book it is? Because I'm seeing all your books I'm on Amazon right now. Like, what book is it that you're talking about swarm intelligence?
Well, it's a book that Roland Snooks and I edited. You might not actually see it on Amazon because it was produced in China, at Tongji University Press. But in any case, some of that thinking in that book is actually incorporated in my recent book on AI, Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. So there's something in there where I bring that up again as a kind of way of thinking.
Okay, I'm going to get that book. Pre-order. Okay.
Oh no, it should be out already. Oh,
there's one, Neil.
There's a machine hallucinations, which is one which has got actually Daniel Bolojan's design, the Kolpumla design, on the front cover. That's coming out in June. Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence came out in the UK in December of last year, and in the States February the 16th, I think it was. So it's been out. But
well, you better go check your Amazon site.
Okay.
It's pre-order.
Okay.
Yeah, but okay, I'm gonna get it and read it. I'm psyched. That's really interesting. Yeah, so obviously this is a situation of a collective intelligence, and it's funny because is it swarm intelligence? Does it fit the technical definition of a swarm, or is it just collective intelligence? I'm curious. I don't know the answer, because when I think of swarms, I think of bees and mobile entities that sort of move and contribute to some sort of collective spatial reaction. But are you okay with considering a global brain a swarm?
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think what I'm not against is this kind of collective unconscious, as though we all thinking the same thing. We're not, as though we're tapping into something out there. I think we're listening to one another, and that's what's kind of the engine behind these things. So that would be my position.
Fascinating.
I mean, just to say one thing. I mean, actually, I'm in California right now, but we this week, Daniel and myself and two on the out of FIU who are doing the DDES, Wan Yu He and Theodoros Galanos, we have a book proposal which is going to Routledge on Tuesday, and it's been very well reviewed and hopefully will happen. And because you mentioned the term AlphaGo, it's called Learning from AlphaGo, and it's really trying to think about how we can use AlphaGo as a tool to understand how our future is going to be mapped out. But I won't go into that now.
Okay, I'm seeing a panel for my center. Let's do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, let's talk. Okay, yeah, so cool. No, this is great. So now, do people have any questions about my global brain argument or swarms? Anything?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Let's put up. Anybody who's following on YouTube, please send it through the chat and also in the discussion here. So I wanted to kind of like to throw something out, and that is this. I guess Andy Clark is someone I know quite well and follow, and what I find interesting, his position in natural born cyborgs that he maps out, where he's you talk about transhumanism, and he's interested in critiquing post-humanism, and his viewpoint, as you know, in terms of the extended mind argument is taken further in natural born cyborgs, where his argument essentially is that it's the plasticity of the brain that allows the human to become this cyborg. And for him, actually, on the front cover of his book, you can see this kind of techno cyborg. But actually, for Andy, anyone with a walking stick or some glasses or a pen is a cyborg. And so he puts it down to the very plasticity of the brain, the fact that we can absorb these tools, we can kind of appropriate them within our body schema. It's as though he kind of takes Merleau-Ponty to the next level, as it were. Now that makes complete sense to me. But what he's saying is that that's precisely the argument why we're not post-human. We're precisely human, and in a sense, the brain remains the center in some senses of everything. Now, if you take that sort of view, you would probably be a bit less concerned about the way in which we could be merging with technology. It's not so, from that perspective, the human still remains the center, and the technology simply becomes a prosthesis that allows greater possibilities. It just enhances the capacity of what we can already do. That would be the kind of, if you took an Andy Clark position and pushed it further, you wouldn't be talking about emergence so much as a kind of enhancement in some ways. I
disagree with Andy. Okay, so, all right, go back to his original extended mind view. He was pretty inclusive in what would constitute you being a cyborg. That is to say that, if you have a smartphone, if you have a piece of paper, your mind is extended. Okay. And I actually don't agree with those cases. I don't think that there's sufficient causal integration in the brain between myself and a piece of paper for it to constitute part of my cognitive or perceptual system. In a sense, it's interesting to cognitive science, for example. I mean, you can define a system however you want, but I don't think that definition of a system is suggestive about the nature of a cognitive process or the nature of a mind. Okay, so I don't think the mind is extended in that sense. But consider what's going on with brain chips. Okay, so consider somebody who has an artificial hippocampus. That's part of a cognitive system. Now, in today's cases, the individual only has the brain augmentation while they're in the lab, so that they're not able to use it outside of the lab. It'll be exciting to see wireless wearable chips of the sort that Musk has been developing utilized in the context of the artificial hippocampus. But they're seeing improvements, restoration of some of the mental functions that had been lost. Now, if that is in my head, and if it's integrated with my mental processes, even with today's technology, if it was just, part of me on an everyday basis, then to me that constitutes extended cognition. Or it could be extended perception if it was a perceptual device. So I think that the extended mind hypothesis is true, but not due to the examples that Andy Clark provides. But if you get into the future where, you're talking about the widespread use of wearable technologies, that is a case, I think, of an extended cognitive system, where the wearables are highly causally integrated. And of course, causal integration can be measured by various, standards. So for example, you might look at integrated information theory, for instance. But anyway, that's where I stand on the issue. And I think, there are ethical distinctions here that are important. So we're not already post-humans, not in any interesting sense. But if we really start wearing brain chips, or if wearable technology is highly integrated, so we're talking about sophisticated feedback loops, and all kinds of wearable devices. So consider like virtual reality platforms that get really good at detecting brain states. So you can detect a brain state through a wearable. There's a wristband that detects states of the brain right now that Facebook has. So if we're in that domain, I think there are distinctive ethical issues that we have to consider. Okay, now here, I'll just list them very quickly because I've already gone on a little too long on this question. I'm sorry. 1, thought ownership. Who owns my thoughts? Who owns that thought data? Okay. Who controls the brain chip? What if the chip does something I don't want it to do? Does the chip make me do it if I kill someone, for example? What about the use of even a passive chip that just kind of notes what you're doing in the context of an authoritarian dictatorship or surveillance capitalism in which the data is collected to sell you things? And then at a deeper level, I mean, I wrote about this in the Financial Times and freaked out. I actually dropped Neuralink stock. It got written up all over the place. It was hilarious. So suppose you have all these chips and it's replacing parts of the biological brain. Well, then you're scooping out the seat of mental processing, right? So you're probably killing yourself, right? I mean, you're diminishing your brain, and even you can use, a full neural replacement case to illustrate that you could even replace your brain with an artificial brain, and it would not be you. You would have died by many people's sense of what is the seat of consciousness and mental functioning in our earthly existence, the brain, right? Okay, so anyway.
Yeah. Can I just maybe pick up on that? Because I was actually yesterday, having read your book, I then started just kind of catching up with Neuralink and seeing what was happening there, because I was following the kind of the mind pong with the monkey and so on last year or so, and it's interesting to see what they're doing now. And what I've noticed is that Elon Musk himself is walking back on the initial claims that somehow we could communicate with each other without even speaking, and so on and so on. And now it's much more kind of cautious, but at the same time optimistic that we can do certain things. Now he's interested in the possibility of what you do with a paraplegic or tetraplegic and so on. And I guess so. At the heart of all this is somehow Stephen Hawking, partly because. Actually, for me, I bought my house from Stephen Hawking in Cambridge, in England, so I kind of have this special relationship with Stephen Hawking. But what is interesting is, on the one hand, Stephen Hawking is kind of claiming that the brain is like a computer, which is always a problematic comment anyway. But at the same time, he was somebody who potentially could really have benefited from the kind of thing that Neuralink's trying to do. In other words, of trying to repair or restore cognitive capacities that have broken down. And I think the word link is almost, it's not so much the human interface thing, but more the way it can link and connect and repair and allow people who are paraplegic to use the mind to do certain things, like even use the internet and so on, which is what they're already doing. And I think the point that I came across, and there was a guy called a brain machine interface specialist from Stanford called Paul Newjuskin. I can't remember his name. Newjuskin. He's at Stanford and really an authority on, and not part of Neuralink, was able to offer some fairly impartial views. And he was very impressed by two things. One was the kind of the number of neurons that they could be connecting with, from going from 200 to 1,000 or 2,000, and also the fact that it was remote, that you weren't literally wired up. And he was being very positive, and I could see certainly initially some real benefits from Neuralink, without getting into the merger scenario, but the possibility of it being helping the Stephen Hawkings of the world to
Yeah, absolutely. And, that would mean for all of us, potential extension of our functioning lives. So, as medical technology is able to push out that lifespan, the cognitive lifespan could be pushed out as well. It'd be very exciting. And, it's a race to see what technologies will be utilized to regenerate the brain. And of course, my take on this is that consider LASIK technology, which is technically an enhancement, I suppose. So like, I'll give you an example. Like, my father went in to get cataracts removed, and the doctor gave him LASIK as well. So, what I think is going to happen in the future is people are going to use these very same technologies to augment their brain. So, if you can create brain chips, you're going to create them to make people smarter as well. There's going to be a market for that, as long as it, is FDA approved, right? In the United States, and there's also a nefarious use, or several nefarious uses as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing we do share, Susan, is definitely is the fact that there's a dark side to AI. I've written two books on AI. One that's just come out already, which has got a white cover, which is about the positive side, and the next one's going to have a black cover, which is about the dark side of AI. But I think the key question is use. I don't see any tool in and of itself being bad, but I think it's a question of who uses it and for what. And you can imagine certain repressive governments using things like facial recognition technology, which is actually quite useful, on our phones, and quite innocent. But when it's used in a certain way, it can be there's a very dark side to that.
Oh, yeah. I think awareness is increased. I mean, I actually work with Congress I advise them on these issues and I present to them. I just did one on the ethics of the metaverse. Yeah, so it obviously it's worrisome. And, I think the global brain, when I presented the argument, I deliberately didn't go into the ethics. I kind of wanted you to have enough time to mull it over. But, you can imagine that depending upon AI regulations and a whole bunch of contingent issues, the global brain could be a good thing or it could be a very, very bad thing. And so really, part of the reason for giving the argument is to encourage people to reflect on the human future, the future of the mind, right? It's why I started the Center for the Future Mind, to focus on issues involving the future of human consciousness and intelligence. Yeah, and it's interesting because we evolved through Darwinian evolution, but as I said, artificial intelligence will actually be a matter of intelligent design, not in a theological sense, but we're the designers, not a God, right? And it's interesting to ask what the evolutionary constraints will be, because, it's still evolution, it's just not Darwinian, right? And there will be all kinds of forces at work. And, I think one principle we might identify is this sort of follow the money principle for the corporations. They're obviously going to be incredibly interested in profit. And they're going to try to have corporation-friendly AI regulations. And those AI regulations will actually be evolutionary constraints on mind design, which is really cool and interesting to think about. So, I think it's so important when we're talking about the global brain and the future of intelligent systems that we don't anthropomorphize. The conditions under which the brain, the biological brain evolved, are going to be entirely different than follow the money principles and AI regulations, which I think are the constraints, as well as Moore's law, you might say, and how much data is available to the systems and what the public wants. For example, how would the public digest the idea of having conscious androids taking care of them? Would they want that? The AI companies won't like it when AI rights groups like, that, which already exists, by the way, say that they can't, that's slavery. And so that means that AI companies' products won't be usable, right? So these kinds of factors, which, you can't really predict at the armchair, are the kind of factors which are going to sculpt the most intelligent system on Earth, which I think is very, very sobering.
No, absolutely. I think also that Jeff Hawkins addressed the question about that particular risk as well. But I wanted to introduce Matt Gorbet, but you mentioned the word anthropomorphism. I want to ask that later. I'll save my question about that later. But I'd like to invite Matt Gorbet, who is a graduate of MIT Media Lab and currently on the DDES program at FIU, to ask his question. Matt, welcome.
Yeah. Oh, you're muted, Matt. We can't hear you. Sorry.
Is this better?
Yes, that's it. Great.
All right. Fantastic. Sorry about that. Thank you. Just thank you, first of all, for bringing up all these issues and starting to talk through them. It's great and fascinating. And some of our other speakers and some of the other discussion we've had has been about consciousness and sort of the role of consciousness and the difference between. We've already talked a little bit about that in terms of prosthesis and extension versus actual consciousness and self-directedness and agency. And I just wanted to ask maybe for a little clarification or a little bit of a better sense of how you see this in terms of the extrapolation from simply, more and more information, people as nodes, people as sensory inputs to a big system, that system being able to process data. When you were talking about that and us becoming a node in a quote unquote global brain, I was thinking about Google Maps, for example, tracking all the cars on the road and then doing some prediction about all the data it's getting. These are all, like, to me, they're certainly an acceleration of what humans do when we publish books or when we talk about information and we process information as a society. But what I'm still not quite clear on or not seeing is the leap from that to this idea of agency and consciousness. It seems like there's always still a goal that's being designed into the system by humans or by the specific organization of those humans. And at what point do you see, you mentioned GPT-3 and you said no particular reason AI won't excel in the way animals and maybe even humans do, but I haven't yet. I mean, they were saying that about the perceptron in 1970, right? They're like, oh, now that we can identify a pattern, we can imagine computers thinking. But is it just a straight shot, or is there some fundamental thing that has to change for there to be true agency and goal setting by this global brain? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. You might wonder if there needs to be some sort of a phase transition, for example. Okay, so let's start with the notion of intelligence. I think lately there's been this very all-inclusive treatment of intelligent systems. And so I'm just happy to run with that. So for example, you've probably seen, reports about slime molds computing intelligent algorithms for navigation. Yeah. And we also know that the shape of intelligence can vary, like contrast the human brain with the more decentralized octopus brain and arms. Okay, so, but intelligence can exist at a planetary level as well. I mean, you can characterize a climate as a kind of intelligent system, for example. So I'm being very open and inclusive. Anything that computes, an algorithm, even at a basic slime mold level, okay, fine. All for the purpose of the book I'm writing, that's intelligent. Obviously, there are different layers of that. Now, at what point would you say that an intelligent system also has goals? Or an intelligent, would you, for example, want it to have human emotion, to have goals? And who creates the goals? So, these are very subtle issues. So for example, in Nick Bostrom's book, he said, well, look, these AIs will have recursive self-improvement algorithms, and they'll begin to shape the nature of their own system. And how would we know that for any goal that we program in, it would actually retain that goal and not generate its own goals? I think that's entirely possible. But you might wonder if something like a primitive thalamus or amygdala, like something like an AI system that mirrors that, so you can see these kinds of systems. I think like Stan Franklin, for example, has like LIDA. There are all kinds of systems like this. You might wonder at what level the machine will actually have something like primitive emotion, which you might think is necessary for goal construction. Okay, yeah, so then you get to issues involving, what it is to have a mind, what's distinctively mental phenomena. And that's where, like, I put my foot down and I say, I'm happy to be inclusive about consciousness. But when it comes to being minded, I think consciousness is a necessary condition. And by consciousness, I mean the felt quality of experience. So I know you hosted David Chalmers recently, so I'm assuming that you're familiar with what philosophers mean by, phenomenal consciousness, or the way it feels from the inside. And I don't think that just because you program a computer to even mirror the human limbic system or some other part of the brain, maybe, some sort of a loop between the, prefrontal cortex and the thalamus, or, there have been all kinds of proposals for what they call machine consciousness. I don't think that will lead to conscious machines, at least not anytime in the future, because it's as if, the analogy I would use is, think about a really crappy music download versus high fidelity sound. If all we're doing is capturing something in very, very broad strokes, why assume it would be conscious? We don't even know what it is about the brain that gives rise to consciousness. The best, yeah, you get it. It could be quantum. Well, maybe Roger Penrose is right. You can't rule that out. So I think,
So,
yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
So I guess just to clarify, so I guess when you say global brain, you don't necessarily mean global mind. Is that,
No.
is okay, great. I just
Yeah.
wanted to try to understand that. Can I ask
Yeah.
one further follow-up? You were talking about, some of the ethical issues, and that's super helpful. And I think we're still going to be searching for that question of what is mind, even if we have these global brain savant / hyper intelligences.
Totally. Yeah.
Can we draw a straight line, or can we learn from the historical questions when it comes to some of these ethical issues? So for example, when you said if a chip causes me to do damage or kill someone or something because of its own, programming, if it's simply then an extension or a prosthesis or something that's making me go faster or do different things, could you say that there are social techniques like cults or brainwashing or even reading certain books that one could say now is affecting me in such a way that I may not be responsible for that thing, given an extreme case where I've been indoctrinated to do a thing, there are precedents for saying, that wasn't me, that was the situation I was in. And perhaps that kind of thing can be extrapolated. How do you feel about that?
I agree with that. I think that's right. And even addiction.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Intoxication. Yeah, that's right. And that might serve as a sort of legal backdrop for some of the discussions.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate your input. Thanks.
Thank you.
Susan, can I just pick up again on some of the questions of intelligence? I mean, I personally will, actually, architects are not so worried about consciousness when they're using AI because we have consciousness, right? And actually, it doesn't really matter if it's generating and building whether an AI is conscious or not. So we don't. It's not our big concern. I'm also a little bit. There are a number of arguments. I mean, Max Tegmark's argument is that we're not always conscious of everything we're doing anyway. I'm also, which is I think very true, and I think GPT-3 somehow reflects that in a way. I'm not so sure we're so different because we do some automatic reflexes the whole time, and we don't really think about them. If you're in Japan, someone bows at you, the next thing you do, you find yourself bowing back. And the famous case when Trump found himself saluting back at a North Korean general, it's almost an instinctual thing which you don't think so much about. So I'm not so concerned about consciousness itself, and I take Yuval Harari's position where he says, well, actually, there are many routes to superintelligence. Not all of them pass through the straits of consciousness. I mean, it's almost a little bit of a red herring. Also, I follow Anil Seth's view that consciousness and computation may be entirely different things. You haven't got to be intelligent to suffer and so on. So I'm not so sure about that. But the question I want to raise, though, is really, and it goes back to your question about anthropomorphization, which I think is really central here. And we had a discussion, strangely, with Philippe Morel yesterday in a tutorial for the DDES. And he was saying, well, I think the real problem is anthropomorphization in the sense that we use certain terms. And I think this is the real problem. The real problem with AI is we're using the term artificial and we're using the term intelligence. Now, I completely agree with your Savant argument. I think that's absolutely interesting. And I think even among humans, we can see that there are certain individuals, including Elon Musk himself, who have, they're not savant, but they kind of Asperger's. I mean, Einstein, and so on, Greta Thunberg, and also Elon Musk. They might not have certain, I don't know, actually, they don't suffer too much, but you imagine an extreme example of Asperger's, no social interaction, but nonetheless often an incredible sort of intellect. So that we already have that disparity anyway. So there are different mediations of intelligence, but I worry that we are transposing onto the computational domain very much a human notion of intelligence, and we're judging it by that standard. I think the point is that that also came out with Jeff Hawkins. He said, well, computers aren't intelligent. I mean, human beings are intelligent and computers aren't. And so he takes a very kind of human-centric viewpoint, but there are others who take another sort of viewpoint saying, well, which is a bit like the AlphaGo story, saying, well, no, actually, these things are, they surpass in their, I don't know, maybe the word is calculation capacity or strategic calculation capacity, human beings. But does that mean intelligence? I think almost the real problem is that we there's this tendency, the whole thing, to anthropomorphize. And alongside that tendency, there is the opposite tendency, which is to say, to the danger of reading oneself as a computer, rather than reading the computer as the self, which is anthropomorphization. It's reading the self as a mechanical device, as a computer. And you imagine how, let's say, the soldier on the battlefield thinks that he's a robot, and but he's not. He's just himself. But the danger of both those situations, and it almost seems to me the real problem is the terminology that we use. If we could get beyond find a different term for computers that doesn't use intelligence and has a different concept, then we wouldn't be in a situation where we'd be saying artificial, because it wouldn't in any way be artificial, just a different form of, I'm not even sure what the word is. It's almost like information, processing information. That's almost the word thing. So I'm wondering whether the term AI in your mind is problematic precisely because it's already doing that anthropomorphization that you talk about.
No, I'm not worried about it. I think it's going to get really confusing later if we start upgrading with brain chips, because then it's like, well, where are we AIs? And you might switch over to like synthetic intelligence, and if we're cyborgs and we're hybrid intelligences. That's what I call it. We're a mix of AI devices and biological devices. I mean, sort of like today's animats. But no, and I honestly, I'm not even that worried about these debates about, when people assert that AI's not real intelligence, because look, if it can beat you at Go, if it can write a B+ undergraduate paper and practically pass a Turing test, depending on the judge. I mean, if you got an AI expert like Gary Marcus as a judge, no, it's not going to pass. You can mess it up still, right? But in some contexts, it would pass. So to me, that's intelligence. Hell, I mean, a slime mold. When you go to these conferences on kinds of minds right now at places like Cambridge and Toronto, that's intelligent. You might, to refine the issue a little more, you might ask, well, what metrics can we utilize to compare different kinds of intelligence? I think the comparative intelligence literature is interesting. So for example, over at DeepMind, they give intelligence tests to the AIs, right? To see what its capacities are. They'll look at, say, object recognition in human infants and test in that domain, for example, or just regular IQ tests. Eventually AI will outperform us in just raw measures of human intelligence. I mean, it already is in various domains, as you know, right? So anyway, that's just my take.
Yeah, I agree with that in certain areas, and I think from that perspective, in fact, it already does outperform us, as you say, in some areas. I in my book, I refer to Margaret Bowden's definition of AI, and her definition is AI seeks to do the kind of things that minds can do. When you think, hold on a second, it can do things better. So, I would almost like rephrase that and say AI seeks to do the kind of things that human minds themselves wish they could do, in some ways.
Yeah.
That we have to. But I just go back to this kind of question. I think what I'm trying to say is that somehow it is suffused with a kind of certain perception of intelligence because we use that word for us, and that's, I guess that's my problem. If you could find a terminology that didn't automatically almost like in a kind of Pavlov dog situation, kind of trigger off certain associations, that might save us from getting into that area. Because I think, I doubt very much we're going to get to machines having consciousness, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But I think we could just rinse it of all those associations and find a terminology that's not so familiar. That's why I'm thinking that kind of like, and it's not information processing because that's been used before, but something with that makes it quite clear that it's kind of calculating, basically, and I think that's why. That's why AI is very, very good at certain things that we're not so good at. And I just taking the position of the architect, for example, what the architect tends to do alongside trying to produce beautiful, elegant buildings and things, there's a kind of strategic calculation going on. Now, what would work in this scenario in terms of planning? In terms of there are all these factors to be considered, and they're very kind of functional factors, frankly. And that's what they discovered with AI in architecture. There's a firm called Spacemaker AI based in Norway that's just been bought up by Autodesk, and they came up with that conclusion. They discovered that actually AI was better at coming up with strategic suggestions for a site. Not a question of what they look like, but how you massed it and how it responded to certain functional requirements like daylight or wind comfort and so on and so on and so on and so on. And therefore, architecture as a discipline is both that kind of calculation, strategic planning, and something else, which is making it look good. And maybe the second phase, making it look good, will come eventually. And I think that Daniel's getting somewhere towards that in his research at FAU. But I almost feel it's that first part. What is that strategic something that we need to find a terminology for? Because that, it seems to me, was what AI is doing, and doing so well.
Yeah. Boy. So, I mean, I'm not sure how to put it. I mean, so let's see. We're both prediction engines, to go back to Jeffrey Hawkins' intelligence as prediction idea. And obviously the human brain is far, far more sophisticated than any current AI. But is there a relevant computational difference? I mean, that depends upon the shape of the algorithms used. So you can look at the brain computationally, like the hippocampus, for example, breaks into several functionally distinctive areas that are causally related to each other, each of which is characterizable by a proprietary algorithm. Similarly with AIs. So I think the difference comes algorithmically, and you can look at it in terms of what the machines do versus what the humans do, right? And but I mean, I think what makes humans distinctive isn't necessarily our intelligence, and that our intelligence is algorithmic. What makes us distinctive is that we're conscious beings, right? Biological beings in general that are at a certain level of sophistication, not just us, but dogs, cats, not clear where consciousness begins, right? But anyway, I think that's what is distinctive. And then you get into, questions of personality and motivation, where humans have like emotions, they have a limbic system, they have, so to me, I guess that's where things stand, sort of. Hey, I was going to ask you something. Can I ask you something?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So when you had Hawkins here, you mentioned in the context of the global brain idea, something that he was working on. Did he have anything of relevance to the global brain?
Actually, I forget whether he mentioned it in our discussion or elsewhere on discussions on that I came on YouTube, but definitely he does touch upon it, definitely. Sorry, I think it was a Lex Friedman interview where he discusses that. But yeah, he did strike me as being interesting, because we've had a range of different people. I mean, Joscha Bach is very much a different position, who kind of favors the computation argument, and Jeff is very much against the idea that computers got any intelligence at all. So I mean, what is interesting, when you bring all these people together, you recognize these different positions that everybody has, which is
I don't think Jeff really, he doesn't seem to believe in AI, but then he uses at least in his old book, which I used to assign to students, because it's a great way to just give them a sense of actually computational neuroscience, even though he doesn't think it's computation. So he's defining computation as a kind of Van Neumann computer, very classical system, and then he says AI is not possible or whatever. And it's like, well, no, the whole book's about AI, really. It's all about computational neuroscience, the brain as a computational engine. And, that was just my take. But what's 1,000 brains then? What's that mean?
Well, I mean, he's let me try. I'm not quite sure if I would do it justice, but his idea is that there are in the neocortex there are all these stacks that are computing, and they vote on things. The outcome. He has this notion of a vote. All these. Is stack the right word? I forget. I need to go back to my notes and find it. But that in the end, there's not just one. There's a whole aggregation, and I don't know quite how they communicate and how they vote and all those things, but that's the analogy he uses.
Yeah, it sounds like Andrew Coward's recommendation architecture or Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model a bit. I mean, I think that's right.
Yeah, neocortical columns. Yeah. So Matt has got another question. Okay. Matt, do you want to go and ask your second question?
Because you brought up Jeff Hawkins on that call and in that discussion, I actually asked him about octopuses and octopus brains and how it's different, because he was so focused on the neocortex and these cortical columns and how they all work together. I said, well, how is that similar or different between an octopus? And he completely, ejected that conversation. He said, I'm not qualified to talk about octopuses. I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm a neuroscientist, and I look at brains. I look at human brains, and I look at the neocortex, and I don't even think an octopus has a neocortex, so I can't talk about that. So I'm super intrigued, because you brought up the octopus, and you brought up slime molds, and you brought up other, quote unquote, other intelligence. So is it fair to say then that, like, from Jeff Hawkins' point of view, intelligence is about the mechanism, but from your perspective, intelligence is more about what it can achieve? Because you were suggesting that to some degree slime molds and climates and octopi could be termed intelligent. So is that the fundamental difference here? You're looking at it from a perspective of what it does versus how it does it?
I think both. I think algorithmic doing it, that, like, as long as it's an algorithmic intelligent, that's sort of the how it does it part. Whereas, some of those systems, like a subset, would be conscious systems. But how it does is a way that we can identify that category. It's sort of like you could give a slime mold a navigation test and you could determine what it does. So I think they're both methods of classifying intelligent systems. And I don't think intelligence needs to be neocortical. I think it's fairly obvious, at least if you accept my inclusive notion of intelligent systems. And I don't know why we want to be exclusive and rule out. I mean, once we start making everything human-like, right, or great ape-like or whatever, like, if we say it's anything with the neocortex, how are we going to identify intelligence outside of that space? I mean, this is kind of akin to the issues that I dealt with when I was the NASA chair with NASA, with finding life, right? The whole point of the problem of life is that we only have one instance of it right now. Everything on Earth is interrelated, as far as we know. We haven't found any microbial life that's unrelated to any other. Maybe it's out there on Earth, but we haven't found it. And if we are to use our parameters for searching for life or searching for intelligence that are highly, biologically driven, we may be missing intelligent life, or in the case of the search for life, other microbial life. And that's why I think we open our minds, like in the context of SETI, the search for alien intelligence, to technosignatures, for example, right? Dyson spheres, stuff like that. Yeah. And similarly, I think we need to look for anomalies, if you will. That was always NASA's expression when we were puzzling over how the heck you find intelligence out there that's different from our own, or life forms that are different. Look for anomalies, right? Mm-hmm. And similarly, don't expect, the global brain to have human incentives, right? Unless the humans program it in. And God knows what those incentives will be. It depends on, which nefarious group or which corporation generates that brain.
To some degree, this speaks to the, I mean, earlier you were saying that people are giving intelligence or navigation tests to these non-human things, whether it's an algorithm or slime mold, but those tests themselves, it's the same issue, right? We're looking for what we know, and we don't know how to look for what we don't know necessarily. So I guess the question is, how do we define new tests for this intelligence that isn't defined based on anthropomorphized intelligence?
No, that's right. And so in my book, you know, first of all, I distinguished intelligence from consciousness, and you know, I suggested that, you know, these things are orthogonal. That was and I think Anil, you know, liked that, and that I think it must have influenced him. We have been on a lot of panels together and whatnot.
Anil said, is it?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like it's from my book, which he read before he, you know, he loved my book, he said, and you know, but anyway, so that's just a minor point, but anyway, you know, well, I don't know, ask your question again, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I was just saying that, I mean, I guess there's a fundamental, I guess, framing or perspective question of, do we evaluate these intelligences based on only the metrics we know? It's like the astrobiology question.
Sorry.
There could be life around us, there could be intelligence around us that we simply can't detect because we don't know what we're looking for. We don't know how to look for it.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, my thoughts were veering because the caffeine was leaving my system. Okay. I offered several tests for machine consciousness in the book.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So and that's exactly a problem. So one test, which I co-authored with a friend, Edwin Turner, is a professor at Princeton in astrophysics, you know, is a sort of question and answer test. And it really does require that the AI have a concept of self, for example. And it really requires that it feel like something, you know, that it be able to express that it feels like something to be it in natural language. And, you know, that test can only be used in carefully defined circumstances, right? And I never argue that that is a necessary condition for attributing consciousness to a system. It's really hard. I mean, you know, there's another test for consciousness that I think will be super helpful. And that one, actually, to go back to the neural prosthetic case, like suppose that we start replacing parts of the brain that underlie conscious experience with chips. I call this the chip test. I think it'll happen. As we do that, we're going to find out if consciousness is preserved. And if we can't get it to work and we give up, right, then I think we have reason to believe that those kinds of chips that are used, not necessarily others, are not the right stuff for consciousness. And so if there's an AI that's made up of that kind of chip, we have reason to be skeptical. I mean, the problem that's going to happen, you know, is that you get these AI systems that are deliberately built to act conscious, like Sophia. Like my lab's now going to program Sophia, you know, help Sophia. Some of my students want to help, but
make it seem conscious. Yeah.
Look, you know, it's puppetry.
Right.
I mean, Sophia is not even that intelligent. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, I guess slime mold level, right? I mean, I wouldn't say she's very intelligent at all. Having been on TV shows with her where she breaks every 5 minutes. There's like, it's like the Wizard of Oz. There's someone in the back who is programming, is talking for her and stuff at various points. Well, she goes through loops that she's already able to do, but.
And there it feels like it's actually the more interesting thing is that we want it to be conscious, you know, that the audience wants to project onto it and see that. And so in a way, that's a totally different thing than can we create these consciousnesses? And it's one of the things that'll shape it towards seeming more human-like or judged by that.
It's terribly disingenuous of the people presenting those shows, for example, to make Sophia sound and look conscious. They're doing it to sensationalize. And in the meantime, they're editing out all the breaks you know, in
Yeah.
which they fixed Sophia because she stopped working. And, you know, so the public's just, I call it the cute and fluffy fallacy.
Yeah.
If it's cute and fluffy, you know, if it looks like my toy poodle, or it looks like some hot female, it's got to be conscious. So watch
Right.
out, people.
Yeah.
Look at
Yeah.
the Japanese androids, right?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people are going to be like marrying them. You know, they wouldn't even care if they're conscious. It's really, as a philosopher, it's like, oh my God. You know,
Problematic.
people. Yeah. I mean, that'll probably be fringe, and, you know, hopefully public understanding of the issues will emerge, and, you know, sensible people will see that sentience, consciousness, these kinds of things matter in relationships. Right? Last time I checked.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's going to be really interesting. And that's why I think we need to open our minds to these kinds of intelligences and understand that, you know, we can't anthropomorphize, even in the cases of designed intelligence in which it's cute and fluffy. You know, don't know if I would run over a robo puppy in my car. Don't think I would want to, but that doesn't mean it really is conscious.
Yeah. What are the implications? So if you run over an octopus, I mean, it's very interesting because we can conceive of different models of intelligence, different models of consciousness, and we can hold them together in the same vein. But some of them we will feel one way or another about, right? So octopi, people are stopping eating octopi now that they feel like they're really smart, and that's great, and I think that's appropriate. But I kind of wonder, you know, we don't actually really have a model for how an octopus thinks. I think we could be a lot more humble about what constitutes a thing we should be concerned about ethically. Maybe that's, anyway, well, we'll maybe leave some room for others.
There's so many, there's like that great film, My Octopus Teacher.
Yeah.
Which I think helped raise awareness. And then, you know, the wonderful books that are coming out, like by people like Peter Godfrey Smith and others. I swam with an octopus the other day, speaking of Florida, I was out here in, I live in Boca Raton, and I was out there, and there's a purple octopus about this big, white underneath. I could not believe it. And it stayed with me for a half an hour. Isn't that cool?
That's amazing. Did it teach you anything?
Did it? No, well, it taught me, it gave me a wonderful day. It made my week, right?
Yeah.
But on a more serious note, yeah, I mean, I really, the thing that the case of the octopus raised for me personally was the issue of the central executive and consciousness even. So in the I wrote a book when I was younger on the language of thought. And, you know, that was based on the work I did with Jerry Fodor, who was my dissertation supervisor. And, you know, we were thinking about how modular the brain is and whether the modules need to be integrated by a sort of central executor. And of course, as someone who's interested in consciousness, there's also the issue of how consciousness is somewhat similar to that central executive in the brain, in that it's slow and serial in a lot of ways. I mean, consciousness is multifaceted, but I mean, it has that aspect. And, you know, when you see these highly decentralized systems that there's no singular place where everything comes together the way there is with the human brain, it makes you think really of what conscious thought would be like for that being, right? I mean, do the arms have the felt quality of experience? And also, you know, from the standpoint of finding out what kinds of systems could be highly intelligent and even more intelligent than humans, what's the relationship between centrality, a singular place where everything comes together or many things come together, and intelligent systems? And, you know, I've always wondered if one of the things about the octopus that makes them the way they are is the timing demands of the underwater environment, being, you know, being chromatophores, excuse me if I mispronounce that, but, you know, having to need to react fairly instantaneously at the level of the arms to, you know, things going on around them, because, you know, neurons are slow. right? And so centrality, it gets, it's about timing. How much can we afford to bring to the central executive? What needs to be done even quicker? And so if you have an intelligent system that is a computronium the size of Earth, it's going to take a lot of time for things to come together. Or, I mean, what if part of the system's on Alpha Centauri? What if we're talking about in planetary intelligence, it's part of a galactic intelligence? I mean, if it takes, 8-year round trip to get information from something in Alpha Centauri, then that's going to be a decentralized system like an octopus. Right. Yeah, interesting.
That's really fascinating.
It is
That's
really
super
fun to
fascinating.
think about the possibilities. As a philosopher, I get to be speculative.
I'm definitely picking that up. I think that's really relevant to the work I'm doing in my dissertation. So thank you, about the decentralized versus centralized. So thank you.
Really? Tell me about, can you say something about it?
Oh, just briefly, we're talking, I mean, I'm looking at control systems for interactive architectural spaces and active objects that use active materials and active matter. So, I mean, this question of decentralized versus centralized comes up all the time. How much should be local and how much should be, a larger process that's designed by the architect or the designer of the space. So these questions of where to situate the processing, especially in a heterogeneous system, are critical. So thank you. I'll look forward to reading that part of your book.
And what are you finding? What's the upshot? Elevator upshot for an elevator?
Right now, the upshot is that it's absolutely going to have, it has to be a mix. And it's clear it has to be a mix, right? You can demo something that is completely puppeted and centralized, centrally controlled, like Sophia, for example, or you can demo something that is completely responsive and completely integrated, but neither one of those is scalable or resilient, right? Neither one of those can be put into the real world for real people to use all the time in an uncontrolled environment, like one would need to build real buildings in the world. So I think it has to be a mix, and figuring out that mix and figuring out principles for that mix is partly what I'm trying to work on. Thank you for asking. Sorry to take all this airtime.
Yeah, that's super cool. Really cool. I'll look forward to reading it.
So we have a couple of questions that are coming in from the chat, but I want to ask Biana first. But let me just make just a couple of comments following up from what you were saying. Sophia, I don't know if you followed some of the comments on that, because Rodney Brooks is very, very negative about Sophia. And there's even one comment from someone else where they said, dismissing it's just like a rubber head with a tape recorder. It's not quite like that, but no, that's the kind of comment. But I do think there's interesting that what this kind of it points towards is the real danger of AI is that it can be marketed in a certain sort of way. And half the time you don't know if it's there or not, right? So it's kind of like the Turing test, but people pretend that, they're playing upon that. And I've actually noticed there are some companies that put AI in their name that do not actually use AI. It becomes simply a kind of form of marketing. So in my book, I make this comment: beware the AI of marketing, which is a bit like beware the Ides of March kind of thing.
Throw blockchain in and you'll sell stock.
Yeah.
And
there was another comment I was making. Yesterday when I was following up this, again going to this kind of like the Neuralink kind of thing. I think the point about it, in terms of the communication, and you said the neurons are slow. Well, that's precisely why Elon Musk wants to speed things up. He's talking they're talking in Neuralink about the problem is how, for example, when we're typing, we do 20 words a minute, 20 words a second, 20 words a minute, I think it is. Is that right? Yeah. But you can speed that up with predictive text to 60 words a minute. But then I think the idea of Neuralink is to be able to speed up that process. That's at least what they're talking about. But I don't want to get stuck in that thing. Maybe we've got also. So first of all, I want to ask Biana to ask a question. Then we've got Gustavo, and then we've got Manos. So Biana, would you like to?
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much for the great conversation. I want to introduce myself first. I'm an assistant professor in Florida International University, where Neil is also teaching, and my background is in architecture, but also media arts. I'm a PhD candidate in media arts at USC School of Cinematic Arts. So I'm very much interested in how immersive and locative media could help us in further sensing our environments. And for the past few years, through several grants, I've worked with computational neuroscientists from UCSD, and further at FIU, we're doing a number of studies funded by National Science Foundation and other grants that are really looking at biometric data extraction using mainly VR, and now we're doing some more studies in AR. And within an institutional setting, the guidelines are quite determined. We sign IRBs, Institutional Review Board, when it comes to working with data and kind of clarifying with what the boundaries are when we have participants. However, these boundaries become blurry when we're going maybe outside of institutions. I'm not saying that IRB guidelines are always correct or they're up to date. So regarding your slide that the heading was, why would anyone provide their thought data? I started to look at this through maybe participation mechanism. So currently game engines are game theory is starting to be looked at as a way that we can think about participation mechanisms. And often these fall under 4 categories. One is financial incentives. So you mentioned in your slide. So for instance, if there's an incentive for somebody to provide their data, so then they have further access to resources, or it could be entertainment, which is what the Niantic model is with Pokemon Go, etc. The other one is activism. So if people feel that sharing their information could further, advance a cause, they would contribute. And the last one is often research. So what I mentioned, the IRB model falls under research. So financial incentive, entertainment, activism, and research. And within big tech, companies like Facebook, or even with Kernel or other, usually these are combination methods. So there's a research component, there's an entertainment component. So then people would participate with UI, UX, but then there's perhaps financial incentives as well. So you mentioned, texts like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. Let's say, I feel like those conversations, either by films like Social Dilemma or even Zuboff's book, not only they've maybe created a conversation, but I have a sense that they've also hindered or made some conversations difficult. I think I have a feeling that, after reading Zuboff's book, there is a neoliberal approach to data. So there's very much the individual against the rest, the individual against the big tech. I think what is missing from this conversation is the larger cause, the greater cause that one could be part of. So for instance, if it is explained to the participants in the beginning of an experiment that the boundaries are clear, data would be anonymized, and other mechanisms would be used to, let's say, hide their privacy concerns, but at the same time, this research would contribute to a larger sensing that is going to, affect humanity, or maybe towards addressing a larger issue. Perhaps reluctancy would be reduced, and then perhaps this could contribute to the way that policies are being put forward. So this was kind of a larger comment and maybe some thoughts. I was wondering, how do you kind of navigate this blurry boundary of privacy versus advancements in research when it comes to larger corporations, but also how could that lead to policy?
Okay. Oh, wow. All right. Very good question. I am working with Congress, so I think about this stuff. With Zuboff's book, I'm trying to remember, it was a while ago that I read it. Was she just, completely saying, look, any sort of large platform that sells your data is bad, and not thinking about regulating it?
Yes, yeah, and I think the larger question was, who knows who decides, and who decides. So she was talking about the multi-layer connection, but the fact that perhaps it's not the companies, but it's the policies and maybe lack of policies But what I felt with the book was that it pretty much had a very neoliberal approach to data acquisition and data ownership, in a sense that there is no larger maybe cohesion in society when it comes to data sharing, and it's you against the world, and you better not share.
Yeah, okay. I mean, lots of people reject who are in the kind of data privacy space, think it should be regulated and optional. And, I think the issues are far more nuanced than just a sort of, no, I will not share my data platform. So, for example, if you own your data and you choose to sell it, that's one option, that people have proposed. Another is that the data agreements be less opaque and more protective of individual privacy concerns, right? And of course, you can have both of these types of policies as well. So I think the issues are super nuanced. I mean, the thing that I worry about the most is actually the monopolization of certain platforms and what that means. So I think these privacy issues will probably be negotiated well, believe it or not. We're getting better at data encryption. We're getting better with regulations, although some countries are far more advanced than the United States, for instance. And some states like California, some people argue is too over the top. But we're moving, I think, into a future in which, at least in democratic countries, there's more data privacy. But what worries me is, look what's happening right now with Facebook, right? With the metaverse. I mean, I'm here close to Miami, where, which is now a tech hub for all kinds of metaverse development, blockchain and crypto. And, there's alternate metaverses out there, but as with, there's a history of how it goes with these tech companies and apps, and the smaller companies just get bought out, right? And so eventually, a metaverse could just be owned by Facebook. And I think that's horrendous, right? Because it controls so much. And you could see the damage that's happened in the past with Facebook. So for me, that's my bigger worry, although it does connect up, obviously, with data privacy. One issue which really concerns me is not being able to opt out. So consider an administrative support person who couldn't use Excel to do his or her work, right? Similarly, when my work environment isn't Zoom, but it's Facebook's Meta, how am I going to opt out of that? I can't opt out of Zoom. God knows what kind of information they're collecting. So anyway, I think there are just so many concerns, but it's very, very nuanced. I'm not sure I've really answered your question.
Yeah, I think it's just it's really fascinating. And then there's these comparisons that I'm sure you're aware that with the 2020 census data collection, because census has been closest that we've had, in terms of historically looking at a larger data collection that has been set up by the governments for people to participate, to participants. And in the past, not being included in census data has been either due to social constraints or due to invisibility. And then with 2020 census data collection, there were a lot of campaigns to encourage people to participate in census data collection. I wonder that eventually, when it comes to data collection in whether we call it metaverse or even when it comes to our relationship to workflows that are set up to allow us to function even day to day, whether our relationship would be similar to a census data collection model, in a sense that encouragement is to be included, because excluding from census data would result in larger issues within society. But then there's there's a certain responsibility that comes with census data, and census data is available to the public. However, there are certain guidelines. I guess this goes back to what you mentioned in terms of you starting conversations with the Congress and kind of larger policymakers, and whether you find this hopeful. And I assume you do. That's why you're engaged. But if you can elaborate a little bit about that, what is kind of the top-down maybe approach to this that is going to allow bottom-up decision-making to be more regulated, or even beginning this top-down and bottom-up conversation in terms of applying policies? Because you mentioned that you are in conversation with the Congress.
So do you mean, I mean, I can't, you're saying top-down approach, and I'm not sure what you mean to what.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you are in conversation with policymakers.
Well, so I'm a philosophy professor. And so what I try to do is I try to encourage conceptual clarity and understanding about the various issues. So for example, people making plans about whether to use AI out in the battlefield need to understand superintelligence and the control problem. They need to understand agency. So there's a lot of those issues. I presented my book to them actually at the Capitol building. I gave a lecture on it, which was it was an honor, and to help them to understand issues involving the future of the mind and understand the nuances and challenges with conscious machines, stuff like that. So, I just think the space is so large. I mean, the issues, for example, I advise on cybersecurity, and the issues are different than some of these issues that I've raised today. It's like getting the businesses to report security breaches has been, a concern. And diplomacy, the shape of diplomacy is different now with algorithms, right? Look at the cybersecurity sphere. How do you respond to cyber attacks by foreign powers? So, there's no one size fits all approach to any of these issues. It's just I'm a very pragmatic person. I think businesses are important. And, I'm not an activist who's out there saying absolutely not to, sharing personal data. But I think we need to make these agreements accessible, brief. The process has to be clear, like what's going on. We have to be very sensitive with children. We have to be understanding of what has been going on with Facebook and all these other social media companies that are relying on like buttons, for example, and amplifying social discontent. I thought the film, The Social Dilemma, did a lovely job. And I recommend that Related Institute, started by the fellow who was interviewed, Tristan, I'm forgetting his last name. But anyway, I don't know if I really answered all of that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Now I have to actually run very shortly.
Okay, well, let's just see, maybe we can do quick answers to them. We've got, well, Gustavo had a quick question, and Manos, who's one of your colleagues, has a quick question, but I don't know whether you could do it very quickly. Up to you. Let's try with Gustavo. If you've got a chance with Gustavo, and then.
Susan, thank you very much. Totally inspired today. I just wanted to ask you just a brief question. What is your, briefly, what would help the United States be more centered at a political level with science and science education? How can they facilitate a work our work as researchers to make better science policy? Like, do they have to go to school, do workshops? What is a pragmatic, practical thing that you could suggest?
Oh, boy.
It's a quick
Yeah.
question.
I don't even know where to start. I mean, you know, first and foremost, pro-science administration is a good thing. We haven't necessarily had that in the past. And funding generously the sciences. And, you know, I'm all for media education. Like, you know, I don't know if that's necessarily the responsibility of government, but that's one of the things I want to do at the new center. Because my big gripe with public understanding of science, and including legislators, is that the poor souls in the media who are like English majors and are assigned to write a blog post in 24 hours on some important topic involving emerging technologies don't have training in the areas that they're writing about. And it's not their fault. I'm not, you know, and journalists are notoriously underpaid, and just the, you know, the requirements on them to jot out pieces, but it leads to an uninformed public where there's a lot of clickbait. And, you know, I see that kind of lack of understanding filtering into government discussions.
Thank you very much.
For Manos to ask this question, I don't know if you...
Sure. One last question, and then
One last question. Yeah. Okay, Manos, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, Susan. Thank you for joining us. This has been a great session. So I just want to go back briefly. Maybe it's more of a comment than a question to the discussion about the decentralized intelligence and your comments about Octopi and the central executive. And I was thinking more and more that it seems that this kind of perpetuation of anthropomorphizing could perhaps prove to be very limiting for our species unless we start studying that aspect of how AI could impact it in the future. For example, I'm thinking in the event we discovered that a different kind of embodiment is necessary besides the neural uplink for our you know, to achieve some kind of augmented perception. You know, are we going to accept it, or is that going to be excluded as something that is currently outside of our familiar search space? I think to us, also as designers, it's interesting with regards to if we extend this discussion to designing, and I know Neil has already discussed this extensively, the fact that, you know, we were looking at what design creativity is, and the fact whether creativity is merely a matter of searching outside of what we currently perceive to be acceptable. This whole notion of what we accept and what we don't, purely on the base of what is known, I think this is important. And so maybe relating that to a very notion of embodiment could be something that urgently needs to be done.
Yeah, no, I mean, you were cutting out. So could you just, in one or two lines, just repeat? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
the audio was flickering.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was referring to the importance of maybe studying how our familiarity with what is, let's say, acceptable both within, on our end as designers, as acceptable design solution space, but also in a broader sense, what embodied intelligence means. You know, and then going back to the concept of the comment about the octopi. If we discover that a decentralized, you know, nervous system is more prone to allow us to inhabit a different kind of hybrid intelligence in the future, how easy is it going to be for us as human species to accept something like that?
Oh, cool. Oh, got it. Okay, now it's a really interesting question. It reminds me of the astronomer Martin Rees would, you know, talk about humans inhabiting other planets and needing to genetically alter themselves very rapidly, not through evolution, but through radical evolution, you know, so that they can deal with the challenges of their new environment, right? And you might wonder, you know, under what context will we have to do that? And, you know, I guess that case suggests that we may not have a choice, right? I mean, maybe our climate change causes us to need to change ourselves through our technology. And how much do we want to preserve of what we are now? I mean, I think there's so many interesting questions here. You know, what is distinctive to us? What makes us human? Or, I mean, is it that we're Homo sapiens? Do we need to technically be Homo sapiens as we move into the future? I mean, if not, that leads to the, you know, cyborg issues and, you know, but if we want to preserve that, that leads to a very different human future. I mean, these are the kind of issues I'm hoping to pursue and develop at the new Center for the Future Mind here in Boca Raton, which I think are very, very fascinating. And, you know, the transhumanists have had lots of interesting discussions. I don't always agree with them, but they have, you know, platforms where they have debates on this issue over at Humanity Plus, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. But I was just merely pointing out the fact that, you know, a lot of discussions about AI and where it's going is kind of excluding discussions on that. Perhaps they, you know, they still exist within a different kind of very isolated way. But I think this is probably going to be one of the toughest things to embrace, you know, assuming that we reach this point of super intelligence sooner than later.
Yeah, yeah. The bioethics literature in philosophy has been pretty interesting on that. So you have these ultra conservatives who are set against any enhancements you know, that involve radical changes. You know, people like Leon Kass, for example. And then on the other side, you have the transhumanists like Nick Bostrom. And then you have, you know, some, you know, there are a lot of other concerns as well, but sometimes there's these debates that are centered on issues like human dignity and whatnot. But anyway, the literature there, which I reproduced some of those issues in an anthology I did called Science Fiction and Philosophy. You know, but there's a lot to think about going back to Brave New World, even.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Susan, thank you for this. I mean, this has been incredible. It's been a global brain, as far as I'm concerned. But I think we've initiated something here, and I mean, certainly when I'm next in southern Florida, we can maybe can get a discussion going. Although we're operating anyway globally, and there are a lot of people involved in this all over the globe, which is fantastic to see and to experience. So I just want to thank you for your generosity. I want to leave you with a final thought, which is kind of, you know, the octopus has come up a lot, but so is the slime mold. And since I want to say that since you mentioned that kind of goal orientation or agency and so on, the slime mold forages for food. That seems to suggest that the slime mold is aware of being hungry and therefore has some level of consciousness. But then you've got the slime mold as being both one entity and a multiplicity of entities, which would seem to sort of talk about maybe the possibility of a swarm consciousness, which kind of like takes you out of the simple self into a different domain. But there are a lot of provocative ideas that have come up today, which have been really useful food for thought for the future. And I think this has been a fantastic session. Really, thank you for your generosity on a Sunday morning. Well, I'm sure there are much more fun things to do, like swimming with octopuses in southern Florida.
Oh, I'm going out right now to the ocean. Yeah. No, it was great. It was really interesting meeting you all. And I really look forward to future collaborations over here. You know, come up to the center sometime, give us a talk or a panel. You know, and I'll definitely be recommending this series to my students too, and listening, you know, to the different talks. And thanks for having me. It was really interesting.
Thanks so much. Please spread the word. I mean, we're trying to share this as much as possible. And it's great to get beyond an architectural community into a philosophy community and so on, and share this. This has been fabulous. So thank you very much, Susan. Fantastic. And let's hope on Tuesday we have a kind of a southern Florida kind of book that comes through on AlphaGo. Let's see. I don't know, but hopefully, fingers crossed. Thank you so much. Thank you also to everyone else who's been contributing to this. And next week we're going to have Andy Clark, who is someone I know very well and someone very dear to my heart. And I think it'll be a very interesting connection. So the whole, maybe you could even see all these sessions within the series as a kind of global brain that are kind of responding to one another in some strange way. But very inspirational, Susan. Fantastic one. I wanted to just say to everyone, here's the book. Go out there and get it. And I think I look forward to the next one. The next one in particular, I know it's going to be called Global Brain, but that sounds really fascinating. And I think you're absolutely onto something there. I'm convinced that you're onto something there. So let's just see what happens. But thank you so much. And thank you to the team behind this that made this possible. This is all based on generosity of individuals who are volunteering their time to launch this thing and to share this information. It's a wonderful idea and a wonderful for you to be part of this. Let's hope we can involve the Center for the Mind even more. It sounds like a fascinating institution. So thank you, and let's look forward to further discussions. Thank you, Susan.
Great. Okay, bye
Join
everyone.
us with Optimus. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.